Hey, deserving listeners, Brandan and Mary, 90 Day Fiancé. Let's watch.
Is that them?
Yeah, they're here now.
Hey.
I don't want to lose Brandan too, so...
Wait, did I see that two of the friends, the names are Jello and Pudding? Or is it Gello and Pudding? Either way, that is awesome. They should form a hip-hop group.
Honestly, there was a few times when I felt jealous of you guys.
You should stop a kind of attitude like that because, as in, we are just friends.
Like, when she went to the beach with you guys, it's like no service. Yeah. So I can't be on the phone, and you guys are just having fun while I'm just like...
Okay, so we're hearing about his jealousy, and we don't know how it played out between the two of them, but from the initial way it's being discussed, it sounds like he gets jealous and maybe somewhat controlling and pointed towards her about it. But I'm going to take a guess, based on the way they're talking about it, that he's nowhere close to the way she reacts to him and the rules. Because it sounds like he never said, you can't have any friends. But maybe he did, so, but let's watch.
And...
You know that already.
Because she would tell me, so I don't overthink. And we don't hide secrets.
So, do you know that Mary unplugged her Wi-Fi, turned off her phone, to go hang out many other time with us?
Jeez, with friends like that, who needs enemies? So the friend is saying, and I'm guessing the producers put him up to this, do you know that we filmed a scene in which she turned off the Wi-Fi so that she could have an excuse to leave her house? I think because if she had the Wi-Fi on and she didn't respond to his video call, I mean, it sounds like she's always the one invading his space, but maybe he invades her space. I don't know. And then, so that she could hang out with the friends. And I remember thinking, well, you're saying it on camera, so eventually he's going to find out. But anyway, so let's see how he reacts here. Okay, so now think if it was reversed. I don't know why I'm doing this, but I'm worried that this is going to become some narrative where it's like, well, they're both crazy and jealous. But there needs to be some kind of scale, some kind of spectrum, because we can't just say that all jealousy and any sort of control or reactivity around jealousy is all the same. It's not. It is not all the same. So I'm just trying to imagine if this was reversed, if she had found this out, she would melt down so fast, she would break up with him so fast. I mean, she melted down over the fact that, and broke up with him over the fact that on the airplane, there was seemingly someone who identifies as a woman sitting next to him. And she broke up with him as he is making 3 flights out to the Philippines to be with her. So let's watch his reaction right here and see if it is anywhere near that.
I don't know what to say because Brandan doesn't know that I sometimes unplug the Wi-Fi so I can hang out with my friends without Brandan knowing. I'll just tell Brandan that we have a power outage.
Okay, so she is saying now that she's done this multiple times and is admitting to lying to him. So this is another data point in terms of what is up with her personality, because there's a lot of notable things here. She feels completely okay with just straight up lying to him. Now, it could be isolated to this, and it could be for understandable reasons, because maybe he is abusive as well. I don't know. There's been talk about him being controlling, and she's complained about how he was upset that she was in dance and that she was in modeling, but we haven't heard the specifics on that. And I'm wondering if production if they have a hand in this to some extent, because I'm wondering if production wants there to be like volatility going both ways rather than just one way. Because if you have it both ways, then there's more interest or something. Because if it's just one person being harmed, it's, I think, maybe less dramatic on some level. But I don't know. I don't know. It's possible that he's, as I've been saying from the beginning, that he's a huge jerkface. We just haven't really seen hard evidence. We've heard allusions to it. So, you know. But anyway, so she's admitting to this and is completely okay with it. I mean, just imagine that your fiance or your partner just had no problem just straight up lying and doing it in the light of day, not only in front of the camera, but telling all your friends that, yeah, this is, I turned off the Wi-Fi. He thinks I'm lying to him right now. Now she would say, well, because he wouldn't let me see you. And I'm a little skeptical that he wouldn't let her hang out with guy friends. I don't know, maybe. And he has his own abandonment issues as well. But I just haven't seen him react in the way that she does yet. I don't know. But he, of course, has a lot of validity in being upset, at the very least, for the lying. I mean, just straight up lying to someone. That's just, ugh.
Mary, what can you say about that? We want you to trust each other.
I know that my friends always want the best for me, and that's why they just want me and Brandan to be honest to each other. But I feel so nervous of how Brandan will react to it. What?
Did you?
Okay, so we're going to have to wait for a while, but he just asked a question. Did you? Is that so? We don't know. I'm really looking to see what he does here as an indication, not necessarily a representation of the way he reacts in situations like this, but I'm trying to get a gauge on to what degree has he been jealous and controlling and possibly abusive.
What?
Did you?
Oh, yeah, ako na.
Yeah.
And then giggling about it. So I wonder, I'm trying to figure out what's going on there, because to just straight up lie to anyone, particularly the love of your life, repeatedly, just out in the open. Because it'd be one thing if she did it off camera and she didn't tell her friends, like when her friends asked, like, oh, what does he think about you hanging out with us? She would say, oh, I don't know. You know, we don't talk all the time and it's fine. But she just does it out in the open. And then, at least according, and I guess there's a possibility production even put her up to doing all those things. Who knows? But it doesn't seem out of the ordinary. But let's just go with what's in the edit as representative, at least, of a part of reality. And then to have that now be revealed. I mean, just imagine that you are now found out by your partner and you're just like, yeah. So there's a couple things here. One is that some arrested development might be at play, and even the way she reacted, it was childish, right? She's a grown woman, and she is now being held to task for straight up lying about something that she would have completely flipped out. She doesn't even want him having friends, let alone hanging out with friends, let alone hang out with women friends, let alone lying to her and not bringing her. She doesn't even let him hang out with his own mother. So... anyway, so so there's a chance of arrested development in that she is that of a child, and when you have a 5-year-old, 10-year-old mentality, the mentality of a child, then you don't really understand how fairness works, because you don't have the responsibilities that would necessitate that, and you don't have the brain development or the life wisdom to understand those things, right? And we don't expect people to have that. But if you have trauma and abuse, then those kinds of elements can be delayed to some extent, right? And for some people, okay, actually, let me talk about this. So early in my career, I started noticing a pattern among teenagers and young adults that I slowly realized or hypothesized or theorized about what was going on, which was that for people that go through significant attachment disruptions post 6 months, and I say post 6 months because there's some evidence that if you have an attachment, meaning that if you're adopted or if you are separated from your primary caregivers pre 6 months, pre 5 months, then because infants, children, they don't have the brain power, they don't have the instinct or whatever. There's some sort of developmental shift that happens around 5, 6, 7 months where the infant identifies who is their caregivers and who is not. Whereas for a month-old child, they're mainly interested in how things feel to them. And so a stranger can pick up a one-month-old child, and if they do things right, then the infant will be okay with it, generally speaking. Whereas with a 9-month-old child, even if you do everything right as a stranger or as an extended relative, that child will not feel at ease with you in all likelihood because they've identified their primary caregivers, both their parents or who, or maybe grandparents are involved, whatever set, maybe it's just a single parent. But that child is like, okay, you are my person and the rest of the world is not. And so I'm concerned with you. And sometimes, hopefully that's a good thing because the primary caregiver is a stable and healthy force. But for some kids, it's not. And so, anyway, point is that if you are adopted or separated from your primary caregivers before that identification happens, then there's evidence suggesting that it doesn't affect the child as much. And sometimes there's evidence suggesting that if you do everything right, if you adopt a child at 2 months old and you do everything right, there won't be any noticeable differences or effects from that separation. Okay. But if you do it post, like at 8 months, there can be significant ripples throughout the rest of that person's life. Not necessarily, but I would see this. And not a lot of people talk about this. And what I would see is that I would have, say, a 20-year-old young man who was adopted at 8 months, and he lacked empathy. He was, as an extension of the lack of empathy, had no problem with lying, might even be called a pathological liar, a compulsive liar, meaning they lie when it doesn't even serve them. They have a hard time planning for the future. They have they have ADHD-like symptoms where they are easily distractible. Their emotions are hard to regulate for them. But it's all related to the attachment disruption that happened when they were 8 months old. They could also have ADHD, but if they didn't, and I didn't conceptualize them as such, and often these kids can be diagnosed with ADHD and prescribed meds, but that's actually not the problem. It's this attachment disruption, because there's nothing in the DSM that actually describes what I'm talking about. DSM meaning our diagnostic manual that we use to justify treatment and guide treatment. And I'm here to tell you that a lot of the human conditions, psychological conditions that are possible for humans, particularly around attachment, are not in the DSM. There's only 2 disorders in the DSM that are overtly related to attachment, and they are 2 extreme versions of things that can happen. Those diagnoses I appreciate to some extent, but they only represent a very small portion of people that have attachment disruptions. Anyway, so for these people, it was very frustrating for the parents because you can have a kid a 15-year-old or a 20-year-old who, in all other respects, seems to be fine. They're smart, they're capable, they're charming, but when it comes to them actually, so you could, this is one fictional profile, but it's based on a lot of different clients I worked with. You could have a 15-year-old child who was doing okay in school and was easygoing and likable, but when you weren't looking at him or you weren't controlling his every move, he would get into your purse and steal your ATM card, or he would break into his brother's room and steal his Nintendo and sell it. He would sneak out at night and not come home for a few days. He would take a bus to another part of the country because he wanted to sell drugs, and he heard in a rap song that if you go to Compton, you can sell drugs there. Or he might, he might call Child Protective Services and lie and say that you, as parents, have been sexually abusing him or something, just because he just is upset at you, sort of. And that behavior just happened over and over and over again. And as caregivers, as parents, or as siblings, or as therapists, you're just wondering, why do you keep doing this sort of stuff? This is a specific kid that I work with. I'll tell you one symptom. He was younger, like 10, and he had a similar situation where he was adopted or separated from his parents post 6 months. And that one was more chaotic because his parents, I think, had a lot of drug issues. So I think he had more of a situation like him. And this kid would, if you weren't watching him, he was compulsively violent on other kids and on his siblings. He was adopted into a family. He had a bunch of adopted siblings, and the parents would tell me that if we don't watch him, as soon as we turn around, he will beeline for one of the siblings and try to hurt them somehow. And he would wake up in the middle of the night and he would move stuff around to mess with the parents' heads. He wanted everyone to be afraid of him. Now, are all adoptees like this? No. I want to be very clear that you can have an attachment disruption and have effects from it, but it not resulting in anything like that. You might have attachment insecurities, but you're not necessarily lying, and you're not necessarily, and you're very unlikely to be violent and intimidating in that way. But I'm saying this because what I found was that it was neurological seeming, that we had missed a developmental window in which it would be best for children to have a consistent caregiver, even if that caregiver wasn't particularly very good. But at least it's a consistent caregiver from 6 months, for the next 4 or 5 years as the brain is developing. Whereas if you have that disruption, the way that I see it, and there's some evidence along these lines, that the brain develops in such a way that it doesn't incorporate other people's feelings because they don't have a chance to zero in on one person. A lot of things happen between infant and parent or parents during those years. Neurologically, the child is really paying attention to what's happening with them. And one of the things that is developing during this time is the ability to mentalize, essentially the ability to empathize. That, okay, because infants are obsessed with their parents. They're just like, okay, what are my parents doing? What do they think? Do they love me? Entertain me? They're just riveted on parents when things are going right, and even when things aren't going right. And they pay attention, and there's all, every minute of every day, there's all these little learning moments, and it's neurological, and connections are being made. When you have that disruption, even if you have a caregiver post 8 months, that the infant might say, well, you're not my caregiver. In fact, you're a I have an instinct to know that even though you're my adopted parents, you're the enemy. Now, Mary was raised by her grandparents. It sounded like as soon as the parents left, the grandparents took over. But we don't know how involved the grandparents were before that. If the grandparents were involved from 0 to 8 months, then that would definitely help in terms of that disruption. In fact, it could completely mitigate it if the grandparents were very much involved. But there's a possibility the grandparents weren't super involved or even around physically. Who knows? But there's this phenomenon, and it's possible that in 100 years or 200 years, when they figure these sorts of things out neurologically, that everything I'm saying isn't consistent with how reality works. But it is a model that I developed over time based on a lot of observations of a lot of people. So there's a possibility that for her, and maybe for him as well, I keep waiting, that lack of empathy. I mean, certainly the reactivity we can attribute to that abandonment, right? But it's also possible that she just doesn't have the capacity to know what would go on in someone's heart and mind and or necessarily care, because neurologically she didn't have that opportunity to develop that during a critical period. And I've seen that before. And what common language or people on the internet will call, it's like, oh, well, look, that's a sociopath or that's a psychopath or antisocial personality. Not necessarily. It's a different version of lack of empathy. I mean, the lack of empathy is notable and consistent and pervasive, but it isn't necessary. I mean, certainly they're not necessarily a psychopath. It could be a road to being a psychopath, and some of the psychopaths that I've studied on this podcast had these kinds of histories where they were adopted early, post 6 months, serial killers, this kind of thing. Again, being adopted post 6 months does not mean it's one of several factors that can lead to that sort of thing. So I just want to be clear on that being adopted at any point, even if it's post 6 months, the vast majority of those folks do have empathy. They have the same amount of empathy as everyone else. And but I did see for some that did lead seemingly to a problem. So did I just negate everything I just said? Anyway, I'm just pointing out just how callous she is right now about this, that you would just think she would have some shame, not shame like I hate myself, but just some acknowledgement of just like, yeah, I know this is kind of a double standard I have here, right? She just doesn't even seem to care.
Mary's telling me about how she would unplug the router and would just like pretend.
That face, she's 23 years old. She looks like she's 12. What's going on there? He looks like he's her father, which is another hypothesis, is that she actually thinks of him as her father, treats him as her father, wants him to be her long-lost father. And that's not uncommon in romantic relationships, and it's not necessarily pathological. But if it's completely that, then obviously that is pathological and it's not going to work usually. And she is now in that mindset of just like, oh no, my friends have now outed me to my dad. I mean, it looks like that, right? And that's not her fault. She doesn't wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to lack empathy and be callous and I'm going to act like I'm 12 because that's my choice. No, we might be watching something that is very concerning and notable, but there's zero volition on her part.
If I were to ever do that to her, she would never forgive me.
Right. Yeah, I think we can all agree on that. I'm still waiting to see what his overall reaction will be here. All right, well, let's adjourn there. And everyone, please take care of yourself because you deserve it. You really, really do.